Hello, everyone. What an amazing gathering. I can see people from around the world gathered in this space. Thank you to Reverend Elder Jim Matulski and Reverend Elder Hector Gutierrez, who worked together along with many others to help us to honor Reverend Steve Pieters today, his life, to celebrate the publication of his book, to share memories, to talk about the impact that he's had on our lives, on the ministry of MCC, and of course, the wider world, his tremendous witness right at the very beginning, and all that that meant over the many years since. And that story keeps being retold from Hollywood to the West End in London. We hear Steve's powerful witness on the Tammy Baker show, and we are witness to everything that he did and said to make such a difference in the world. Reverend Elder Jim will introduce our panelists, but it's my delight to open us in prayer today. So please pray as you feel comfortable, and let us truly know that we are connected around the world at this time. God, you called Steve Pieters into being. You made him in your own image and likeness, a delightful, proud, passionate, activist fairy, a man of deep faith, deep commitment, huge laughter, great passion. As we honor his ministry, his life, his thoughts, as we recall memories, sometimes laughter-filled, sometimes anger-filled, or filled with tears, may we be in gratitude for the gift that we are exploring today. I ask for a blessing on all our panelists, the aspects of Steve that they will lift up, the words of wisdom, prophecy, encouragement that they will share. And may we leave this space at the end, renewed, inspired, encouraged, and delighted by sharing this time together. In your many names, in the name of Jesus, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, we pray. Amen. Thank you, Reverend Elder Jim.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, Reverend Elder Hector, and all the people on the MCC staff who have made this amazing gathering possible. It really couldn't have, there's a lot of people you're not seeing online, that you won't see online today, but who have worked splicing and adding and organizing. So thank you to all the MCC people who are making this possible. My name is Jim Matulski, and I have known Steve Pieters since the very late 1970s. And when we were all exhorters, as they were called at that time, in MCC, and got to know him best, or first, more in depth at a conference called Gay and Christian that was held by MCC Good Shepherd Parish in Chicago, where theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther worked with us as a group to make sure that liberation theology was a part of the MCC DNA. And that's where we all sort of started to connect across geographical lines at MCC. There was definitely a liberal or progressive or activist axis, and Steve was part of that, and we were part of that. So I'm appreciative of all the different kinds of people we were able to bring together today. I want to do a special shout out also to one person, Timothy Smith, who was Steve's special friend, who made sure that all the previous memorial services that we have had for Steve took place, and were beautiful tributes to him and to his life. So this is not meant to take the place of those previous services, but to be additive and cumulative to the record of who Steve Pieters was and is for us. And it's occasioned by the publication of his book, which I hope you'll read. If you haven't, you'll purchase and read, called Love is Greater Than AIDS, a Memoir of Survival, Healing, and Hope. Steve worked on this book the last few years of his life, worked diligently on it. And it's my only sadness about it, and others have said this, is that he didn't live to see it in print. But he did get to see its final form, and his imprint is in it every step of the way. And this book, this tribute today, is a celebration of the publication of the book. And I called this event, Remembering Steve Pieters, Activist, Pastor, Theologian. And I called it that because while the other tributes to Steve will have focused on his interactions with Tammy Faye Baker and the impact that that had in subsequent years, and the film and the plays and all the acclaim that Steve got to enjoy, which was so cool. There's more to Steve than that one narrative. And those of us who have known him know that we knew him at different times in his life, and sometimes continuously through these times. And I wanted to make sure that as part of the record, if you will, that we had an occasion to remember Steve as those things: activist, pastor, theologian. I'm going to use just one quote from the book as emblematic of his theology from page 216. I love life. I don't want to miss anything. And though that may seem like a simple statement, he really embodied that throughout his life as a pastor, as an editor and writer, as a journalist in a sense for MCC, as a performer, as a preacher, as an activist. And so that's what we're doing here today. I've asked a number of important MCC voices and theologians to be part of this, people who have known Steve. And what I think distinguishes this is all the people who you're hearing from today know Steve or knew him. And we bring that to an appreciation of this book, which I hope will find a wide audience over time. So I'm just going to tell you who the people are, and then we're going to have some sharing from each of them. And a couple of them couldn't be here that were originally advertised, and I'll read a statement from one of them. And then there'll be time for panelist interaction and audience questions too. You can put questions in the chat as they come to you. So that's what we're doing. And we're going to begin with, oh no, I'm going to introduce the people, sorry. So in the order that you'll hear from them, you've already heard from Reverend Cecilia, our moderator, Reverend Nancy Radclyffe, who lives down in St. Catharines, Ontario, Keith, and who is featured quite a bit in the book for her relationship with Steve when MCC had a chaplain to the clergy at one time. That was very important, especially when we were so isolated and doing the work we were doing. Nancy's a hero in her own right. Keith Mozingo, longtime MCC pastor and pastor of Steve's Church, Founders MCC, and will tell us, I hope, a little bit about what it was like to have Steve visit when he was a pastor in some other places and what it meant there. Mona West, Reverend Elder Mona West, is a biblical theologian, currently working at St. David's Episcopal Church in Austin, Texas, but with a long, distinguished career in MCC doing formation and education, and really is one of the profound MCC theological heavy hitters, if you will, and so proud to see her. Lucia Chappelle, I can't say enough. Lucia, the hymn writer, Lucia, the activist, Lucia, the journalist and the radio personality, Lucia, the historian, Lucia, the minister. I just watched a sermon she did at All Saints Episcopal Church in Pasadena, and again, emblematic of the best of the MCC theologians. And you'll hear from her partly about her personal relationship with Steve at a critical point. And I wanted to lift up especially that Lucia reminds us of a part of our history that we may not all be familiar with, a time when we had feminist or women's churches in MCC. It's a proud, noble part, and they were there for Steve in a particular way. So Lucia, I can't say enough. I'm so glad that you're here. Working down Justin Sabia-Tanis, uh, again, Dr. Tanis, is on the faculty of the United Theological Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a professor of social transformation, a distinguished author and theologian also, and a former MCC staff member for many, many years at a critical period of growth and change for us. So we're glad to have Dr. Tanis. And Karen Ziegler, was especially dear to me. Karen and I go back literally to the late 1970s when we all knew Steve. Uh, and she was the pastor at one time of MCC New York during the longest part of the AIDS years. And then went on to do more AIDS work. She became a nurse practitioner and has done a lot of work in trauma work with veterans and just a variety of things, and is herself a spiritual leader and political activist in Durham, Raleigh. So Karen, we're glad you're part of this. Nancy Wilson, Reverend Elder Nancy Wilson, is the pastor of Suncoast Cathedral, I think, in Venice, Florida. Could not be here today, but worked on, and you'll see, one of the most beautiful video tributes I've ever seen. And I know you'll be moved by it, and I'm so glad it's part of the history here. And she also was Steve's pastor in Los Angeles and many things. So that's who you'll hear from. We also have some audio and video clips that I want to thank Tammy for putting together. They were sent to us from Nancy, not from Nancy, from Lucia Chappelle and Karen Ziegler, who did the research to find them. And that's how we'll begin. Long introduction. Let's go to it. Let's hear from Steve and see some pictures of Steve just to sort of set the tone.
At County USC, I saw Dr. Alexandra Levine. She's been my doctor ever since. From the first time I saw her, she touched me like she cared. She touched me and didn't make medical excuses for it. They cut out the lymph gland, and a week later I went back for what I thought was the appointment that would give me the biopsy results. I walked in the clinic, and after about 3 hours, the surgeon came in. And he said, "You have a terminal cancer of the lymph glands." So I got home and I started calling everybody's answering machine. "Hi, this is Steve Pieters. I've just been diagnosed with terminal cancer. I'd appreciate a call sometime." The next morning I woke up crying. It's only one of 2 times in my whole life I can remember waking up with tears streaming down my face. Well, if this was a tragedy, I decided I needed to start playing the opposite. I put on videotapes of I Love Lucy. I must have watched the Vitamita Vegemin episode about 300 times. I ordered pizza and served up great big bowls of ice cream. I started cheerleading myself by singing everything from gospel to Broadway musicals. I would drive around the freeways with a Judy Garland tape in the deck, screaming at the top of my lungs, "When I get to that Swanee." 2 weeks after I was officially diagnosed, I was invited to preach the Easter sermon at the Metropolitan Community Church in the Valley. I was determined to change terminal to life-threatening. I decided what Easter meant to me was that they could tell me the worst thing possible, like I wasn't going to live to see 1985, which they'd already told me, and I could still dance. And I did. I tap danced throughout that Easter sermon. It's become my whole approach to living with AIDS. In January of '85, Dr. Levine invited me to be patient number 1 in the very first AIDS trial of an antiviral drug called Suramin. Suramin does major damage. It's a highly toxic drug, and I died one night because of it. Obviously, my death didn't take, but for a few minutes there, I was gone. The hospital called one night and said my adrenal glands were failing. I remember it was 7:30 because I was watching a rerun of MASH. I said, "Can't it wait until morning?" And they said, "No, you'll be dead by morning." Well, they lost me in emergency for 3 hours. I began to pray with every breath, as I'd been taught by Stephen Levine in his workshop on death and dying. My particular mantra was, "Lord Jesus Christ, have love upon me, a good fairy. Lord Jesus Christ, have love upon me, a good fairy." I remember not caring just breathing into the pain. And suddenly, I felt a peace that I cannot explain. I've never felt anything like it before or since. I was surrounded by love. I understood the wholeness of my life in a way I never understood it before. It's taken away my fear of dying alone, my fear of being dead. All the other serum and guinea pigs are dead. I haven't been sick with anything worse than the flu in over 4 years, but I'm still HIV positive, and I still get scared. But I believe in God's love, and I believe in fairies. Remember Peter Pan when Tinkerbell is dying because people don't believe in fairies? Peter says, clap your hands if you believe in fairies. Clap your hands to bring all good fairies back to life.
And we have to believe in ourselves, not only as individuals, but as a church. And we're in the Smithsonian now. We're in the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. We're part of history. And my fairy wand is there. And think about what that means to me. I mean, wow. If I could, I do tell that little boy inside of me that still hurts when he's called a fairy. I tell him, look, your fairy wand was valued enough to be put in the Smithsonian. Yeah. So believe in yourself as you go from here. Just know who you are and be that person. The words are, just as I am, without one plea. I know thy love is poured on me. And so I worship thee as me. Just as I am, I come to thee.
So again, thank you for finding those clips. If you found it a little hard to hear, you can find all of those stories recounted in the book, and you can read it word for word. So that's my pitch for buying the book. But thanks for those. Tammy lovingly put together those things for us. I'm going to ask Nancy Radclyffe to start us off. So Nancy, you're on. And you're muted.
There we go. Well, I'm just very happy to be here today. And Steve's and mine was like a 40-year friendship, chaplaincy-ship, whatever you want to call it. Not always nonstop by any means. There would be weeks, sometimes years between us being very involved with each other and finding the things that in each of our lives, really, it started out much more my being chaplain to Steve, but it went back and forth from then on. And what I want to, the piece of this book that I want to bring to you this evening is the piece that where Steve describes whether or not we're realizing it as we're reading it. His oh, why can't I remember words when I need them? His own personal study guide or line of pursuit to be well, to become well, to stay well. And I'm going to start, this actually starts on page 44 of Steve's book, in case that you have not seen this. He writes, I took it seriously when Dr. Levine, and Dr. Levine was mentioned previously, but she's got to be the greatest the greatest doctor going, and was with Steve as his doctor until Steve said goodbye the last time. He writes, I took it seriously when Dr. Levine told me about creating conditions in my body for a treatment to work when one came along. I developed my own wellness plan. There were no books or articles about recovering from AIDS, but I read books about people surviving supposedly terminal cancers. And he goes on, he lists about 7, 8 of those. I don't know that I'll cover all of them, but the most important ones I certainly will. And should jump here with this wellness plan of Steve's became doubly important to me in the spring of this year when I was diagnosed with cancer. And one of my first thoughts is, I've got to go back and see what Steve did when he got his diagnoses of terminal illnesses. Seems equally important to say that Steve survived more than one of these, more than one time of going to meet his maker and then coming back. So first thing he says is singing was a big part of my healing work. Singing, he loved singing. Gaiman's chorus of LA, whatever excuse to sing, Steve would take advantage of it. And started off pretty early on by just driving the freeways of LA, of which there are many, and singing to the top of his lungs to whatever was on his CDs or the radio or whatever. We don't think of something like singing perhaps as being part of our healing device, but it was a big deal for him and made a very, very big difference. He went back into the gym and building his body once again. He added in studying nutrition, what he should be eating and drinking properly to survive. A very important piece, since Steve believed in the power of prayer, was to ask every friend that he knew, please pray for me so that I may survive. Throughout the MCC denomination, this request went out from Steve to others, to many of us. And right on its coattails was meditation, daily meditation, usually more than once a day. His doctor, Dr. Levine, once again, prescribed meditation for him and told him to treat it that way, with those multiple times a day, so that he would be ready for the, quote, cure, not really there, but for that treatment when it came along. And he could visualize his body, the T cells, and the whatever else was creating problems in his body. He could visualize them giving way to the Holy Spirit's influence in his body, mind, and spirit. Laughter, from Norman Cousins' book, how important it was to laugh in order to heal. And so he started watching regularly I Love Lucy, MASH, Cheers, just to laugh over and over and over again. And as Lucia will know, if you wanted a good laugh, just go over to Steve's place and he'd dial one up for you. He was a strong smoker, something like a pack-a-day smoker. And he decided, I need to give this up. And with the help of the puncture, I wouldn't say acupuncture, is that what it's called? Anyway, you know what I mean, the Eastern medicine, that through the use of that and a practitioner, he was able to stop smoking entirely. That is a huge deal. I couldn't believe he had done it. And probably at least half the time, I didn't know what he was doing for himself. Sometimes I did. We talked about it. He would share something to me. Other times I would find out about it later, and sometimes not until I read his book here. He also got into body work with other people, guiding what was happening, what in and with his body, and how through prayer of something like Reiki, his body could respond to their prayers, to their movements over his body, and he could feel how these were actually making a change in his body. Steve also became very good friends with Tammy Faye's son. And they were mutually good friends to each other until Steve indeed once again said goodbye. And that was one of the most amazing nights in my life, of when Tim and others there with him in Steve's hospital room started calling others of us and saying, Steve is getting ready to go. You may want to call in. And I, like many others, did call in, or others just appeared at the hospital and were around his bed by cell phones, literally around his head, and people around the bed, praying for him, talking to him. He was not the most talkative at that point or able to respond, but you knew each time that he knew somebody else had joined the group. And quietly together, we said goodbye. And thank you, Steve. Thank you.
And Keith, you're on.
I just wanted to say briefly that I'm having been here as the pastor at Founders MCC only since 2018. For years before that, when I first came into MCC, I was in Raleigh, North Carolina. Reverend June Norris was my first pastor, and then Reverend Wayne Lindsay. And I don't remember, I only knew June briefly, but while Wayne was my pastor, I was music director. And I remember Steve coming, traveling for the denomination, and he came and preached for us and held workshops about AIDS. And I mentioned this to him several years ago when I came here to pastor, and we went out to eat several times. And I said to him, you know, Steve, things shifted after you came that one weekend. Things shifted in our thinking at St. John's MCC. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, there were those who were living with HIV and AIDS who had nothing but a death sentence before you came. It was just assumed if you became HIV positive, it would turn into full-blown AIDS, and then the process, soon you would be gone. You weren't going to be here very long. And those of us who did not have HIV, we were always scared of getting it because we all knew it was going to be the death sentence. That's all it was to any of us. And after you left, the things that you you said and the things that you did, and yes, your fairy wand and some of your music and all of that resounded with us. But what was most important was your presence with us, just to let us know that there was hope. There was somebody living with this. There was someone who had changed terminal to life-threatening, even with AIDS. And I noticed on page 115 of his book, he mentions one of his nurses who told him this, but they were talking about the cancer's going in remission. He said, the nurse said, it's no mistake that this has happened to a highly visible clergyman. God needs a vehicle of hope, and you're it. And I just want to say that I'm glad that I got to share these last few years with Steve as his pastor. Again, we shared several meals together. When I first got here, he was very faithful to be at church. He would sit with Troy Perry and Philip every Sunday on the second or third row of the middle section of the sanctuary. And I was glad to be able to share with him, you indeed brought that hope. And he thanked me for letting him know that things had shifted because of his ministry of presence that weekend. And so I just wanted to share that little tidbit, that little bit of information, because I have a feeling that was what was happening all over the world, everywhere he went.
Thank you, Keith. Mona.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Nancy. I want to just kind of, Jim asked us to maybe pick a piece of the book or a quote and to share. And what I'd like to do is just comment on the whole book. Basically, just to kind of step back and just to offer my impressions about Steve and Steve's writing. Really what came up for me when I finished the book was that this is really a memoir of Steve's body. We talk about sexuality and spirituality and healing the body-spirit split. And, as I was reading the book, Steve's body was talking, as well as Steve. I mean, Steve's writing gave voice to his body. And it reminded me of a concept that French philosopher Michel Foucault talked about. He talked about inscribing the body, or the inscribed body. And that basically what he means by that is that the body is a legible object of historical study, to study the history of AIDS in this case, to study issues around gender, politics, systems, structures. And so Steve's body was an inscribed body. And as I thought about that concept more, I think Nancy already mentioned it. I mean, he was a body builder. He paid attention to his body in terms of partnering with it or in terms of healing. But he was a body worker and attracted to men with particular kinds of bodies. His body made him famous. He kind of alludes to that toward the end of the book. But other things I would say as I just sort of step back and think about Steve's body is, of course, his body was a body with AIDS. His body was an addicted body. He shares quite vulnerably about his addiction. It was a sexual body. He also is very graphic in a couple of places about his sexual activity, and possibly the first time that he had anal sex was probably when he contracted AIDS. His was a body that longed to be touched. I love those passages in the book where he made it a point to talk about being hugged, by either Dr. Levine or the first time that he was allowed inside the studio for an interview instead of having to stay outside. And he was very clear in the book about the different times that that his body was touched. His was a consecrated body. He was ordained at MCC. He was a pastor. He was a chaplain. So his body was set aside for holy purposes. His body was a healed body. And his body was also a sick and dying body. His body was an experimental body with the drug trial, the experimental drug Suriname. His body was a surviving body. And I think that's the thing that, or one of the things that amazes us about his story and his journey. And of course, his body was an MCC body. And so reading through this book, just, not only is it Steve's history of AIDS and AIDS research, but it's the story of MCC and MCC's roots. And I have to say, as someone who was involved in the formation of clergy in MCC, I really appreciated the ways in which the book highlighted Steve's educational journey. He talked about CPE early on. I mean, who knew? I mean, CPE back in the early days of MCC. It wasn't like a recent thing that was added. He went to seminary. He also went back to school and became a therapist. So I appreciated that part of the book too, his educational journey, but also just a reminder of just the ways in which MCC has been intentional about training its clergy and doing the work that needs to be done to equip people for ministry. And so those are just some of my takeaways. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to the next person is in reading the book, I don't remember that prayer that I heard on the video clip that was shared at the beginning, but it's the prayer that was on the video clip. Lord Jesus Christ, have love upon me. I'm a fairy. That's actually a rewrite of an Eastern Orthodox, a very ancient Eastern Orthodox, the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. So I just so appreciated hearing that in Steve's voice. So I'll close with that.
Thank you, Mona. That was beautiful. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from a larger essay that Reverend Dr. Bob Shore-Goss sent me. Bob, I think I mentioned, is a one-time MCC minister, one-time Jesuit priest, now a UCC minister living in Florida, and a serious theologian with many books published, including, salient to this, Jesus Acted Up, a Gay and Lesbian Manifesto is the title of that. And Bob sent me this essay because it started out talking about Steve and then sort of became an excursus on many theological writings about HIV/AIDS. So I'm not going to read all those. I hope Bob will publish this whole essay, because it's brilliant. But one of the things that people who've read the book have had in common is we've all said it triggers a lot of memories of our own lives and some of our losses too. It's hard to read at times. So I'm just going to read a little part from Bob Shore-Goss's essay. So this is Bob. Imagine Bob. I genuinely welcomed reading Steve's autobiographical account of his journey with AIDS. I met him only a few times and had limited engagement. I found myself on his journey to struggle with HIV disease and find a lasting love in his love. It seems that he found a love from a number of MCC church members, a celebrity status and limelight with Hollywood's political leaders and Tammy Faye Baker. He was a great ambassador. But Steve's support system was unique, and he survived many more decades than many others. He lived with health challenges and frustrations, but he lived. And I'm grateful for his life and witness of living with AIDS for so much longer. I'm so aware of the many gay men with AIDS who were not so fortunate. They experienced intense social isolation and exclusion from families, churches, and from the health system. I read Steve's memoir with vivid memories of the trauma, pain, and suffering, denial of health care, of experienced pastoral care as abuse. They stigmatized as deviant and sinners. Some committed suicide, and many lived with little hope. This remains vivid in my memories. German theologian Johannes Baptist Metz coined the term the dangerous memories of suffering. My gay queer liberation theology was forged in this climate of suffering solidarity with and the memories of life, loss, and grief of many men and friends living and dying with AIDS, including my spouse Frank and my brother Bill, who died on the same day. I witnessed such trauma, and looking back at the summer of 1992, I remember so little because of my own intense trauma of grief and loss. This is the social location that compelled me to write several works and co-authored a book on grief and bereavement. I wrote Jesus Acted Up in 4 months to channel my anger and grief that I witnessed in accompanying the journeys of many men in their suffering and loss. I watched Pose, and there were very few episodes that I didn't break into tears. It's taken years to mitigate grief into acceptance of the giftedness of people lost and the time to accompany them. I was genuinely glad Steve survived the worst years of the pandemic and find moments of flourishing in Hollywood and with celebrities. He had access to significantly show the face of AIDS. I'm happy that he lived many more years to represent people that were in need of Christ's compassion and love, and now his story was a quilt panel representing the faces of many more people in need. And then just from the end of the essay, I wrote in Jesus Acted Up, a leather jacket of HIV positive individual reads, God is HIV positive. The inscription asserts God's solidarity with HIV infected people, their marginalization and suffering. Queer Christians witness in their lovemaking. To reject people living with HIV illness is to reject God. So that was Bob Shore-Goss's reflection, and I'm going to make it available when we make the recording of this available too. So now we're going to go to Reverend Lucia Chappelle.
There I am. Okay, here I am. Hello all. Thank you, everybody. Wonderful things being said. I want to read something that's in the book, and I want to talk about something that's not in the book. And if you want to follow with me, I'm starting on page 204. The Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles has played an important role in my survival for many years. I first encountered the chorus in the summer of 1984, a few months after being told I would not live to see 1985. I was reeling with grief and anxiety about the diagnosis and prognosis. The concert was held in the Hollywood High School auditorium. I was skeptical about the chorus, wondering if their concert would be campy and silly or just not very good. When they entered and filled the risers, I was overwhelmed. Here were more than 100 handsome gay men singing beautifully. I wept. Singing had been an important part of my life since I was a toddler. In recent years, the only singing I had done was hymns in church and tunes in my shower or my car. Now I yearned to be up there singing with these amazing gay men, but I was afraid I would not live to have that chance. Early in January 1994, I finally auditioned for the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles. I was resistant because of my travels and all my board work, but now Christy urged me to join because she knew I needed something to anchor me in Los Angeles. Remembering how I'd sat at that first concert and wept that I would never get to sing with them, I decided to audition. I was nervous, but I nailed it. John Bailey, then the artistic director, invited me to join the chorus. I accepted and quickly became more excited about the prospect of singing with them. It would be wonderful, too, not to be in a leadership role. At my first rehearsal, I was surprised to see IV poles, but of course, this was a group of 150 gay men in 1994 when AIDS was ravaging our community. IV poles were common even in grocery stores in those days. Our weekly rehearsals would often end with a memorial for a member who had died from the complications of AIDS that week. John Bailey stopped the rehearsal 20 minutes before the end and gave us all time to share remembrances of that person. At the end, we stood with our arms around each other and sang John Rutter's Gaelic blessing. We hugged and wept for the brother who had just died. And skipping ahead, in the last few years, chorus members have been an enormous help in my ability to stay safe from COVID-19 by doing my shopping, helping me with my trash cans, and just keeping me company. I treasure the community we share as gay men who love to sing and dance. The chorus continued to give me hope and joy in equal measure. It played a big part in my ability to survive and thrive throughout the years. That's what's in the book. Let me talk about what's not in the book. Often when Stephen and I would do speaking gigs together, he would often talk about how he felt that the women's community, in particular De Colores MCC, had really rallied around him and helped him and supported him in those early times. I'm not sure if that's because he thought I would hit him if he didn't say that, but then he did. The thing was that all the wonderful gay male community he's talking about in the chorus was not there at the beginning. Gay men were, and when Steve, in fact, even before he got sick, when he first moved to LA, he was really frustrated by not being able to connect more with a gay male community. Even at the gym, there were the guys that he would work out with, but he couldn't really have a conversation with. And he wasn't able to make that connection. And I don't think he knew it, but the disappointment around that made him really angry. And there were times that he lashed out at me. And I would go home and realize, oh gosh, Stephen's mad because I'm not a man. But I mean, just things like he would say, oh, well, I need somebody to help me do this. Oh, I'll help you do that. I don't want you to help me do that, Lucia. Oh, he wants a man friend to help him do that. I understand. And it really wasn't until he got involved in the chorus, a decade later, that he was able to find gay men that would be with him and walk with him and be beside him that way. I think it just took that amount of time for the gay male community to, I don't want to say get over, but get past the constant terror of catching AIDS to find the compassion of being with each other with AIDS. That took time. And in a way, I think it also took some modeling from the lesbian community. One of the early actions, even before there was ACT UP, there was Blood Sisters. Blood Sisters was a campaign when gay men couldn't give blood and gay men were in the hospital needing transfusions. Lesbians organized to go in together and give blood. Blood Sisters. And I think, and that was kind of the beginning of the modeling, and then the caretaking and the just being present. And finally, the guys caught on. Oh, there is something else that I must not forget. Oh, please. Oh, I would be really cast into the pit if I forgot this. The Reverend Elder Moderator Troy Perry asked me to be sure to bring you his greetings.
Thank you.
And to say that one thing he remembers is we used to go to lunch together often, Troy and Philip and Stephen and I. And one of the last times I got sick, I wasn't able to go. And they were on their way to the little vegan restaurant where they usually go with me. And Troy said, all of a sudden he looked at Stephen and said, "Hey, Lucia's not here. You want to go get a steak?" So they all went out and got a steak. And I never let him forget it. You know, you got that steak just because I was sick. So hello from Troy. And there's my Steve stories for today.
Thank you, Lucia. Brilliant, as always. Justin.
I am so grateful to Steve's life and ministry for reconnecting us all once again this afternoon. A number of years ago, a collection of MCC archival material came to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies and Religion where I was working. And I had the opportunity to revisit so many of the documents and images of events that I recalled. And I also had the joy of being surprised by wonderful things that I didn't remember. And then there was this particular revelation of seeing something that was familiar, but with new eyes. And that was my experience with the Alert newsletters, which stood for AIDS legislation, education, research, and treatment. But it was indeed an alert for what was happening during the AIDS crisis. And Steve, of course, was the editor of that newsletter and the author of pamphlets, articles, and teaching materials in MCC about AIDS. The insight I had when I looked at the work that Steve had done is just how revolutionary it was, which is something I appreciate more and more as the years pass. So I'm an academic who teaches queer theology and the history of HIV and AIDS. So let me observe that the first Alert newsletter that came from MCC that Steve worked on came out in 1987, which is less than 6 months after the founding of the activist group ACT UP. Before that organization had really taken off globally. And the earliest of the theological books on AIDS were just being written, a few books here. And most of the community was still shifting from shock and taking care of emergency needs to medical, legal, and societal advocacy. But Steve, along with Don Eastman and other folks who were on this call, were already offering the kind of information that ACT UP would become known for, giving people concrete information that would improve their rates of survival. So through MCC's AIDS ministry, Steve was already offering more spiritual hope and direct support than the most esteemed theologians and pastors in the country. The Alert newsletters are packed with practical tips, summaries of new clinical trials and medical information, stories of AIDS ministries from around the world, and discussions of how public policy was shaping the world of those living with and dying from AIDS. Alert was practical, realistic, and at the same time hopeful. In the pamphlet that Steve wrote called Spiritual Strength for Survival, Finding Hope to be Fully Alive with HIV and AIDS, it was published in 1989 for MCC's General Conference that year. Steve wrote this powerful theological statement in the conclusion. He says, "It is only when we can truly embrace the inevitability of death that we can fully embrace the truth of the resurrection." And that truth tells us that when we live with a life-threatening infection like HIV, we believe that the risen Christ, Emmanuel, God with us, is alive here and now, helping us to transform our pain, fear, and anger into life-giving creative action. And that's exactly what Steve and Alert and the other aspects of AIDS ministry and MCC did, transformed the very real challenges of AIDS into life-giving creative action. By the way, there's surprisingly little written by Steve in those Alert newsletters, far less than I had sort of remembered. But you can see this editorial principle throughout. He didn't take up column space when there was life-giving news to report instead. But Steve also countered the view that faith or information or willpower alone could heal AIDS. Steve's AIDS ministry also came at a time when people understood Louise Hay and others to be saying that they were responsible for healing their ways of thinking and living, which would in turn free them from the illnesses caused by the virus. In the chapter of his book on his AIDS ministry, Steve wrote movingly about this, and this is also something I heard in my own ministry, so it really touched me. Steve wrote, quote, "Sometimes people dying from AIDS at the hospice told me they felt like they'd failed somehow. They just didn't work hard enough or believe fully enough, and so they brought on their own death. Of course, I told them that it wasn't their fault, that sometimes the work of healing can end in the healing of death. And Steve also held it as a mystery about why he himself had survived for so long when so many others hadn't. There's a spiritual profundity in his conviction that, yes, it is godly work to give as much information as we can to help people survive and to challenge the idea that death from AIDS is inevitable. But he was also very aware that life and death are not controllable in the ways we might want, that faith alone does not guarantee a particular outcome, and that death itself can be the ultimate healing as we return to the comforting embrace of God. So I want to close with another statement that's at the end of that pamphlet on spiritual tools for survival. It speaks to me of both where Steve is now and how he counseled us to live. Steve wrote, "Look for God's grace every day. Look for evidence of the resurrection. Believe in God's love for you, and in turn, share that love with others, and that will give you life." Thank you.
Just close the window that has what we're doing next. Help me, Lord.
It's amazing to hear all of this.
There we go.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for everything that you're saying. When Steve was 17 years old, he went to Interlochen Music Camp and played The Sorcerer, the Gilbert and Sullivan musical. And I know that because I was in the chorus. I was 16. And we figured that out many years later when we were both pastors in the Northeast District. He took out his photo album to show me, you know, there he was as the sorcerer, the star of the show. And I was in the front row of the chorus in a little dress. And so we were always bonded, always bonded about that. And I spent some time with him at his family's farm that really helped him, that place. And I saw him not too long before he died. There's a lot of suffering in this book. He suffered so much. And I'm just going to read a little paragraph from 152. I was still traveling to churches and conferences all over, and he traveled all over internationally. And with my theater training, I was somehow able to share my story of surviving AIDS and to inspire others to live with AIDS as fully as they could. Yet when I got home, I would fall into such despair that all I could do was smoke endless amounts of marijuana and zone out in front of the TV, although nothing much made me laugh or cry. Part of what he suffered from during periods of time was depression. And during that time that we knew him, and he was the face of AIDS, and it was a face of light. It was a face of joy. He was suffering his own depression and his own struggles. I appreciated this book so much because it brought back so many memories, and some of them very painful, you know, remembering the stigma of AIDS in those days. You know, we all had friends who were in the hospital whose food was left outside the door. And there's so many stories about that kind of thing. And I loved reading in the book about the time Coretta Scott King hugged him after he introduced her. And, you know, that was how people responded to him. He was magic, like the sorcerer. He really was magic. And I also, you know, remember the stigma of being gay. Like Troy Perry planned his funeral with his parents in 1985, and he died in 1923. When he died, there was an extensive obituary in the New York Times. And in it, Steve is quoted as saying he always knew he was different from age 3. And when he was a teenager and came out to his pastor said, never mention this to anyone. And the magic that he did, and other people did this too, but he was a large part of why the stigma was gradually eroded in some communities that never even knew any gay people, you know, and let alone hugged someone who with AIDS. The magic that he did to help us all overcome the stigma of being gay. And I just want to really thank MCC, because I know for myself coming out, it was MCC that made me fall in love with queer people. And of course, Steve was one of the people I fell in love with. That what we were doing in those early days together of learning to love ourselves, falling in love with each other, he really captures a piece of that. And I loved reading the last page of the book. You know, I'm not going to read this, but there is a long list of all of the terrible physical things that he suffered from in his life, many more than I was aware of, painful things, difficult things. And then adding to that, the periods of depression where he had to just really be a performer to bring that magic to us. He says, none of us has any guarantees that we will be here tomorrow. All any of us have is this moment. So in this moment, I rejoice that I have survived all I have survived, because I would not have wanted to miss a single moment. It's an incredible thing to say, considering how much suffering there was in his life. I would not have wanted to miss a single moment of all that I have lived to see. In this moment, I feel deep gratitude and joy. And to read this book, I felt so much gratitude and joy that he was able to say that at the end of the book, at the end of his life. The last time I saw him, he was in New York, and I happened to be in New York. So he invited me over to his hotel room, and he showed me his outfit that he was going to wear on the red carpet. And of course, it had always been a dream of his to walk the red carpet. And he was so filled with joy. Joy was something that he gave us and gave the world. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Reverend Nancy Wilson, and I'm proud to be here as part of this honoring of Reverend Steve Pieters and his wonderful new book. As I read Steve's memoir, I realized I knew the overall story and lots of details, but there was so much more I didn't understand. I could not put the book down. Maybe if I had put it down, I wouldn't pick it up again, because there are some of us who were not infected by HIV, but who also still call ourselves survivors and claim some PTSD. And reading this book really was a surefire trigger. In his account of his life with AIDS, I see three paradoxes. The paradox of glory and suffering. Though I knew how much Steve suffered from HIV and AIDS, the tremendous highs and lows, the starting from scratch and regaining health over and over again, and then being overcome by something new and different was exhausting to read, much less to live. His accounts of his descent into alcoholism and drug addiction were almost more unbearable in their intensity and pain. I remember years ago visiting him in LA after I'd moved to Florida. He contacted me and confessed that he was totally paranoid, that the whole time I was visiting, I knew that he was intoxicated and in desperate shape. But I knew no such thing because I was clueless since I didn't see him on a regular basis. By then, he was in recovery, but reading about how he nearly lost his life more than once to alcohol and drug addiction was more of a revelation than his AIDS ups and downs. He tells of the heartbreaking story of using substances medicinally and then how those nearly killed him. Walter Brueggemann said that redemption happens most thoroughly through the public processing of pain. Steve has given us this in his account of his life. And there was also glory, lots of glory. Steve, who was starstruck from childhood, had Shirley MacLaine introduce him to Stevie Wonder. He was the first in so many ways to be the public face of AIDS, with his unique courage to call on God, to dance and to hope when there was no hope. He was our hero, our poster boy for good, and he paid a price for it. And after one of his near-death experiences, he broke through to the evangelical world through the improbable lens of Tammy Faye Bakker. It is the stuff movies are made of and was made of. Oscar parties, Elton John, so many things. My favorite is when President Bill Clinton turns to Steve at the White House for advice on oral sex. As Don Eastman says, you can't make this stuff up. In the midst of glory and suffering, there was a calling, to quote him on page 27 of his book. Then one day I crawled from my bed to the bathroom, feeling as sick as I'd ever been, and I had a clear and transcendent moment. I became certain that I would be healthy one day again, and my current suffering would help others. I felt as if God were telling me to take notes, because this agonizing experience would be the basis of a whole new ministry. Somehow this relieved me and gave me hope. Another paradox is between relationship and loneliness. Steve struggled his whole life yearning for a life partner, someone to care for and who would care for him with love and loyalty, with consistency and sanity. But that never happened. His disappointments at times with friends and family, for good reason, are searingly poignant. In some of the worst times of his suffering, he is alone or feels abandoned. At the same time, what an amazing, rich, connected life this was, and still is, that draws us here today. He maintained countless friendships from his earliest life, doctors who took him into their familial spaces, and colleagues and friends who were devoted to him, hundreds of ecumenical religious friends, chorus friends, lovers, activists, TVs and movie stars, people he met in hospital rooms and at the gym. I do not know if I've ever known anyone who could make you feel like you were so important to him, a part of his core life, even if you weren't. He was a friend when I was his pastor, in the way of offering gentle criticism. Reverend Danny Mahoney was on our staff dying of AIDS at home, and Steve said to me, if I was new to this church, I would never know from the last 3 Sundays of worship that our assistant pastor was dying at home. He was right. Though I visited Danny almost daily, I had stopped making sure we lifted him up in worship. Denial was a constant stalker every day, and sometimes we succumbed. I cringed at the passage in which he noted my letting him down when I had promised he could call me night or day when his father died. And when that night came, and I did not pick up the phone in the middle of the night, as a pastor or friend, how often I've made a promise that was hard to keep or that I didn't keep. In compassion for myself, I know what my life was like as pastor of Founders MCC in those days, and I imagine that I was exhausted or distracted, but I had wounded Steve in the way that hurt him the most, feeling alone. I bless his honesty that does not spare us or himself, and the forgiveness that flowed from him as well. He says on page 53, I'd been so worried that I was going to die without ever having a life partner. But in reflecting on my time with all these wonderful friends and family, I realized they collectively loved me in the way a single life partner would love me. It was as if I had had a partner in Mosaic. I felt loved and not so alone. We were all Steve's life partners, and with that intensity and commitment, and sometimes with the disappointment, as life partners may do from time to time. Finally, the paradox of frailty and strength. I think of St. Paul's reflection, my grace is sufficient to you, for my power is made perfect in weakness, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Steve's frailty, battling with illness, addiction, and raging loneliness, became the things that drove him closer to God, to a deep spiritual life that brought him and many thousands of people strength. I love the ending of the book where he is describing the moment where those creating the Tammy Faye Bakker movie discover that he is still alive after all. It's the second great Easter story in this book. I still have the recording of Steve's phone call to me after I called him, congratulating him on being discovered by Hollywood in this way. The joy and aliveness in his beautiful baritone voice is something I just don't have the heart to erase. Thank you for the privilege of participating today. God bless you all.
Brilliant. So for those who are watching the agenda, the run of show, we're going to go off a little bit and invite people, everyone who's here, if they want to share questions, you can either put them in the chat and for the panelists and we can answer them. That's probably the easiest way. And I'm just going to do my quick little summary of the things I wanted to be sure that we said about Steve quickly. The best way to remember Steve is to live like he lived. And I hope that we can do that. The things that he mentioned in the book as pastor, activist, theologian include being active in your healthcare. There's a beautiful description of a workshop he does with his doctor, Alexander Levine, about a doctor and patient being in partnership with each other. We can all do that and be active in our own healthcare, as well as active for universal healthcare, something Steve and I talked about a lot as a passion of his. Another thing is this. Steve experienced acutely, and Lucia reminded us of this, Nancy Radclyffe also, that he was a deeply committed feminist. And in this time when reproductive justice for women and for people who can become pregnant are imperiled, one way we repay this debt is by all of us, and particularly the men I'm speaking to, be advocates for women's reproductive justice. Also, Steve, the political activist, when he was at the White House, this is described in the book, and he used his one big moment to speak to President Clinton, he used it to talk about immigration advocacy and immigration justice, particularly for people with HIV. But I think if he were here right now, he would say, no, I meant for everybody. So in this moment where xenophobia is so strong, one of our best ways of being strong and living like Steve is to remember his passion. He used his one big shot with the president to talk about immigration advocacy and justice. And we also can do the same. And finally, vote, 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 vote. Okay. I'll say one more thing at the end, but right now I want to see if there are questions in the chat. People help me out, and panelists, if you want to add anything to this, your mics should be able to be open. So go ahead.
There weren't any questions in the chat, just comments.
Okay. God, I wish I could read them, but I can't because my vision. There are great comments in the chat though. And one compliment is for Nancy Wilson's beautiful eulogy at Phillips Academy Andover, that particular memorial service. And we should find a way to make those comments available because they are beautiful. Speakers, panelists, did anything occur to you that you want to make as a final point, or that you want to bring up about Steve or his passion? Go ahead. Who was that? Can't tell. So just go ahead, panelists, and comment.
I did want to reflect on one thing that I was thinking about as I read Steve's book and as I was thinking about this, that the role of MCC as the place that offered spiritual care for people when no one else was, or when denominations lift up the one minister who is doing it as opposed to all of our clergy. I think it's really important to recognize just, I really firmly believe that God called MCC into existence in part in order to offer ministry in the face of HIV and AIDS when no one else would. And I think about my parents who are the World War II generation who talk about that being the greatest generation because of the sacrifices they made. I also think of the tremendous sacrifices that people in MCC made in order to maybe not answer every single late night phone call, but almost every, you know what I mean? Like Nancy sort of talks about the flaw of not answering that one phone call, but I also think of how people spent nights and nights and nights without sleeping to answer all of those phone calls. And I just think the more I reflect as a theologian, looking at queer history, the more awed I am by what was accomplished by MCC in general, by Steve in particular, and by, you know, just the tremendous work that people did. And so I just feel, I feel deeply grateful, and also, I guess, this very tender part of my heart for the suffering, the collective suffering of that experience, and also the collective blessing of the kind of ministry people were able to offer. So,
Yeah.
I'm going to read something that someone put in the comments. Dave Meyer. I knew Steve as a longtime friend, high school years. It's so cool to listen to all these professional and cultural colleagues in a realm that was beyond my awareness. In one of my last conversations with Steve, he admitted to being terrified of dying. The contrast between his public testimony and his private terror is striking. And we all live with contradictions. And Maxwell Ray says, thank you to all of our panelists. I first met Steve when he came to London in 1992, prior to going to district conference in Hamburg. We will gather again in Hamburg for a network gathering next month. I will remember Steve when we gather. And Cecilia has just put in the chat a link to the MCC archives that are at the LGBT Center for Gender Studies at Pacific School of Religion. And there's a huge, that's where our biggest collection of archival materials are. Justin especially was responsible at a certain point for getting much of the material digitized. That's why it's available to you online right now. All those alert newsletters, for example, can be found online through the California State Library. And you'll hear more about this in the weeks to come, months to come, but MCC and the PSR are partnering on a project to digitize more of the MCC material. And the first material we're going to digitize next is Troy Perry's sermons and speeches, so that will be available widely. So you'll hear more about that. This is a note to make a future donation. And I will add this. I encourage you to make a donation today, if you can, to the MCC endowment in Steve's memory. That endowment provides another revenue stream for MCC and will help it as it continues to evolve and change into whatever's next. So make sure that our legacy continues and has the resources. Make a donation today to the MCC endowment in memory of Steve. Lucia, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, one of the things that's so important about continuing to remember Steve's work and the work that we've all shared in is because I had the extraordinary experience just a couple of years ago of talking to a fellow at Founders MCC who was going to be starting a new HIV support group. And he told that one of the people in leadership in the church had told him that they should start trying to write things about theology around AIDS because no one had ever done it before. Well, after I wiped off the pieces of my brain on the floor after my head exploded, I said, what on earth do you mean no one's ever done it before? Do you think we have been sitting around with our thumbs in our you-know-whats for the last 40 years? What do you think we've been doing all this time? But it's not been, we all know it, but many other people do not. And it's time for us to take our stuff out there and make sure.
Yeah, and if you'll pardon a theological observation for me, the distinctive that comes through in this book and how MCC's voice is different is this. Other denominations, and we were involved with them, especially through Don Eastman's important work, had commissions and studies that were about ministry to people with AIDS. But in MCC, it was ministry by people with HIV and AIDS in partnership with others who was doing the ministry. So the difference between, same thing with our National Council of Churches representation. The other churches had representatives, many of whom were gay, who would represent gay people. We were the gay people in those conversations, open, out, proud. And
Right.
that's the distinct
Mhm.
difference and contribution of MCC in this period of history.
Yes.
I want to be sure we read, Alexander Levine just put a comment in, and his her relationship with Steve is chronicled beautifully in the book. She says, massive thanks to each of you who helped Steve to survive and thrive over 4 decades of AIDS. He was a special human being. I was lucky to call him my friend.
Oh,
Dr.
Yes.
Alexander Levine.
oh. Thank you, Dr. Levine.
Yes.
So I think we're going to wrap up our time, and I really want to thank everyone for participating. I want to close with a scripture that Steve meditated upon. It's also, many people commented on this throughout the book. You'll find that he talks about the importance of an active spiritual life. It changes and evolves over the years. This was the scripture he used for meditation, and we'll let this be our benediction. Steve, or his, from Isaiah 41:10, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will lift you up with my victorious right hand. Isaiah 41:10. So that's our program for today. And I think we can let people stay on if they want to chat for a few minutes. I'm not sure what that will look like, but let's just see. And one more shout out of thanks to Reverend Elder Hector Gutierrez and all the tech staff, Mike Haas, Tammy, Wanda Floyd, who worked today to make sure we could do this at a time when people could hopefully come. So thank you for that. All right. Consider us done. We will make the link available when we have it. And people can chat if they want somehow. Not sure how that
Thank
works.
you so much, Jim. Thank you so much.
Yes, Jim. Thank you.